there was a time, Jeff, when you were maybe a little more easily understood.
Well, certainly easily amused because I liked Friends. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. I'm your host, Jeff, and with me is my co-host, Alan. On the first and third Tuesday of every month, we bring to you our perspectives on theology and culture from a post-evangelical lens. Thank you for joining us for another conversation to provoke your progressive Christian imagination. This week, we are going to talk about the past. Specifically, how do we reconcile our past context with our current context, which I think is probably a good question, or at least something that all of us struggle with to a certain extent when we've gone from a major theological and cultural shift in our thinking, which is, obviously the catalyst for this particular podcast. And to close out the show, we are going to be sharing our top 3 things that have not aged well since our childhood. So this is a topic that is really important, and I'm surprised that we really haven't given it the weight and the attention that it deserves on the show thus far. But I'm sure many of us who have converted or moved from evangelicalism in some way, shape, or form, or even just a conservative context, who are now, although I don't want to make the assumption that all of our listeners are not conservative, because we welcome all people listening to our show. Right. But at least for us as the hosts, a catalyst has been, how do we then interact with people from our past churches, especially for Alan and I? We've both worked in churches as pastors, as evangelical pastors, and how do we maneuver that? And this is especially relevant to us right now because Alan, we should be congratulating him, is now an official ordained reverend in the UCC. So Alan, congratulations. This whole topic of being like in one context and out of another is probably very fresh for you. I'm sure your introduction into the UC, your official introduction into the UCC has been quite the contrast to your past ministry experience.
It's a strange feeling filling out invitations to different people from the past. I mean, I sent invitations to all of my previous churches to come to my ordination, the ministers that I've been involved with, my home church, and just thinking through, like, what is my relationship to all of them? Like, are they going to accept the invitation? Would they come? I mean, I had at my ordination, I had a minister who was gay preached, a woman preached, and these are things that we were told were, like unforgivable sins in ministry, which is just crazy to me now, but it was very real to me back then. And so at my ordination, not everybody showed up. I had kind of one student that represented all of my youth ministry. I had some friends from high school that represented all of my past that I came from. But besides that, it was my family and my new context, my new religious family. And strange would be the first place that I would start. It's just a weird place to be. I think anybody who is in a new religious context looks backwards and is like, it's a different life, or it's just, you feel odd. You feel a sense of like disembodiment or something. On this podcast, we've walked through the evangelical wilderness, so to speak, and maybe I found one little outcropping that I've discovered and joined in the UCC. It is huge for me, and I love it. But I look backward across what I've been through, back to where I've been before, and I have lots of weird feelings about it, And part of my question for this episode is like, how do you navigate those feelings? Do you have any use for them again? I mean, there are people listening to this that will have no use for their previous contexts. Maybe they're angry or hurt, or they're still going through a grieving process for being rejected or something, or just rejecting what they're a part of. And so everyone's at different places. But for me, Jeff, I don't know about for you, but for me, I felt like I've kind of gone through a grief process, like reintegration, thinking about different things. And like now I find myself, how do I relate to my previous context? And I'm doing it. So I think this episode, the reason it's so late in coming is like, I've had a lot of processing to do to get to this place, to be able to start thinking about how do I relate? Because at first it was like, well, there's no option to relate. I don't belong. Like maybe I'm not welcome, or maybe I don't want them, and it's not needed in my life right now. But that's where I'm at now. And ordination was super fun. I recommend it for anyone that wants to do ministry. It's a long process, but geez, it was really cool. And I wore a robe, like I said I would.
The robe. He
the
donned
white robe.
The robe. Every time I think of the robe, I think of that movie Hot Fuzz, The Greater Good.
I do not have a hood, but I do know there are some people who do have hoods on their robes, and I think of that too.
I feel like if I went with the robe, I would definitely do the hood.
Yeah.
There's something
It's cool.
ominous about it.
There is. You know, you feel that's pretty significant, very monkish. I know what I'm going to say as to like how I relate or what has helped me in relating to my previous context, but I kind of want to let you maybe speak just a bit. I'm curious, Jeff. I'm a youth pastor who's been a part of a lot of different churches, and I know what it's like to be a former leader that maybe doesn't occupy the same space I once did for people. I mean, I've had students message me and be like, I once respected you. Not so much anymore because of where you're at. You know, I followed you. I looked up to you maybe, but, you know, not so much anymore. And so I have weird feelings and relationships with all of that. And I'm wondering about you. Are you still in touch with like your former churches or the pastors that you worked with or under or a part of or students? And what is that like for you?
Well, I think before I answer that, I think we should preface for those of you listening that we're talking in the context of connecting with people who we had good relationships with, who are friends. And we know that a lot of people, the catalyst for them shifting over to a new thought is through sometimes a means of abuse or things that have happened, which requires distance and never requires a reconnection. So I feel like we just need to put that out there in the beginning.
That's a great caveat. We're not recommending anyone re-enter into abusive relationships, whether it's spiritual abuse or emotional or physical.
Right.
Like there's space for forgiveness, but you don't have to be with someone or in the same room as someone or friends on Facebook or something. That's really well said.
Absolutely. So I think for me, I think probably for both of us, it feels a little bit more extreme because I've always said that as a pastor of a church, and I found this to be true so far in mainline denominations and then our former context is evangelicals, you're never really a part of the community. You're hired. There's always a sense of they'll be around, but then we'll have someone else come to fill that position, and there's just this ebb and flow on how that goes. So I think there was always an isolation to a certain extent. But then once I was out of it and how I reconnected, part of the difficulty also was the kind of the unsaid ethic amongst pastors is that once you leave, you're not allowed to really go out of your way and stay in contact with people. You have to rely on people to contact you.
In some churches, it's not even unsaid. I mean, in the UCC, you're not allowed for a year to like be in the church that you served.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that's the same for the denomination I'm with right now. So I had a difficult time at first. I don't have any lasting connections with any of the senior pastors I worked with. Part of the reason was that I've been pretty vocal and, those relationships, had a tendency to be rocky, especially after a while. And, but I actually I maintain a close friendship with people that I worked with that were with me. So at my first church, I had probably the biggest staff because I just got thrown into this machine of a borderline, I wouldn't say mega church, but certainly a large church. And I just recently had a reunion with all of the people that I worked with this last summer. And it was wonderful to reconnect and find that we're all kind of sort of in the same place, which was nice. And then at my last church, the last church I was at as an evangelical minister, I'm still really close and get together regularly with the pastor, the associate pastor that I worked with at that church. And that's probably one of the few relationships I have from that last context where we can sit down and talk regularly, disagree, throw our stuff out there, and still have a lot in common and connect. And I think that's probably been the biggest anchor for me from just like jumping ship and completely disconnecting, because it's always been good conversations, because there's times that I've wanted to disconnect. And I've never had anyone email me directly or contact me directly and say, this is how I used to think. I've just heard whispers and rumors, and no one
tends to be how it is.
Yeah.
Right. And also that relationship you have with that associate minister sounds pretty special. I mean, that's few and far between that there's someone willing to still have a relationship with you, even after you've like left that context or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually I still worked with him after, even though I had moved away from that and he was a senior pastor. There was a nonprofit wing from that church for a little time that I helped manage a secondhand store, and we still worked with him. I still was helping him out with his office administration, and if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have had a job after I quit the church, because I couldn't find anything else, because it was hard to convince an employer that an ex-youth pastor had any value to their company. Yeah.
Take your guitar playing skills and your goatee somewhere else.
That's right. Son. Now that my goatee's gray, I think maybe it would help out a little bit.
I think I have like a weirder, I think my story maybe even be a little weirder than that, because I grew up in a church for 12 or 13 years in the same spot. And then I went to college with a lot of the people that were connected to that church, because it's a very small community. You know, our theology was very small and specific and not really welcoming of anyone on the outside. So we took all of our leaders from one college, and they came and served as interns at our church. And so when I think about my previous context, I think of my home church growing up. You know, I hear you about being set apart, like leadership in the different churches I serve between now and then. I feel that too. But when I think about my home church that I grew up in, that's what I think about when I think about my previous context, not just where I worked, but that specifically. And then also the school I went to, because a lot of those people were, you know, the heads of the school when I went there were, when I was in junior high, they were in college, and they were interns that were in charge of, like, you know, youth group and stuff. So just a pretty small community. And, providentially, Facebook was invented and came out when I was a freshman in college, and you had to be in college to get on Facebook. So I had everyone back then just added each other. Same school, you just add each other. That's how it went. We thought that this was going to be like a school thing, not a family thing necessarily, but like, here's our whole school is connected by Facebook. So it's been 10 years of kind of slowly losing relationships on Facebook, which is mostly normal because I don't know them anymore. And so that just kind of goes by the wayside. But there's also conversations with people from the past. You know, I'm in touch weekly with people. I don't know if you have this, but I like weekly have conversations with people from my past, like from a church growing up I had, or from my first youth ministry when I was in college, and people feel like comfortable enough to interact with me. And I find myself like kind of reconnecting with all of that on a regular basis. And, speaking of my home church, tell me if you felt this way about yours. Have you gone back to your home church in like the last 10 years or so?
No. Well,
you grew up in?
I think the last time I went was, it's probably been about 10 years, maybe 9 or 10 years. One of the students that I trained as a youth pastor, who was my junior high director for a while, became the youth pastor of the church that I grew up in. So I went to his first Sunday. And I think that was like, man, that was almost 10 years ago, maybe? Can't be. I feel old. Let's stop talking about that.
I know, right? I went with some of my friends through Oregon recently, back in, I think, it must be June or July. And we went through Oregon, stopped in O'Brien, Oregon, which was like, I guess, my hometown. A lot of like white trash like me everywhere. It was awesome. I felt very, I don't mean to be judgmental of anyone who identifies that way. You're my people. No, seriously, there was like teepees on the side of the road you could rent to like sleep in. That's kind of what O'Brien, Oregon is. And there's like, 30 people there and one bar and like no grocery store. It's pretty amazing. And we decided, after going through Oregon, Crater Lake and stuff, all that stuff, we decided to go back home, to go to our hometown. And so we picked up a high school friend on the way, in Bakersfield. And I grew up in Tehachapi, which is this tiny little mountain town, and, went back home to the church I grew up in. This is like the second time I returned. I returned 2.5 years ago, after my 10-year reunion in high school. But we went back there recently, and every time I go back, it gets even smaller. Like, the building is so small. Like, I walk in, I'm, oh my gosh. I know everybody feels this way about certain things, like maybe the house they grew up in, but like small in space and like theological breadth, you know, like a lot of different things. It's just, it was really big to me back then. Certain things were really big to me, and now they're smaller. And
I used to think that was a kid thing, but 2 years ago, 2 years ago, I went back to the church that I was at before my last church as an evangelical youth pastor. And I went back there for memorial service, and it was small. And I'm about the same size. I always used to think it was like a kid thing, like you're this big
Like
and then
when
you
you're a
grow up
kid.
and you're older and everything's smaller. But I wonder if it's just time or distance or what makes it seem so much bigger, even as an adult. That's strange that you mentioned that. Sorry, go ahead.
It's the same thing with video games. I look back at like, GoldenEye on Nintendo 64. I go back and play and it's just like garbage. I can't even see what's going on the TV. But back then it was just so amazing. So I go back there and I'll just be blunt. Like there were elements of my growing up of evangelicalism that were maybe spiritually abusive, some ideas that were really hard, on my psyche as a teenager and on people I knew that I think are wrong and they're hurtful. But my experience at church at large was like, that was my heart, man. Like that was everything for me. I loved it. I mean, I loved everything about my church and I gave myself fully to it when I was a kid. So going back there, there's this nostalgia. I long for the day when reading the Bible was simple. You just read it and you apply it. There's no interpretation. There's no layers of meaning. There's no like, oh, is this text weaponized in some ways? Is it misunderstood? Like, let's actually wrestle with the text. None of that. You just read it basically and it ministers straight to your heart. And you look out your window at the mountains and stuff growing up in that area and everything was simple. I mean, it was also the town too. In that town, everything was simple. There's not a whole lot of diversity and everybody looks and thinks pretty much the same. And, I longed for those days. Like, everything's all traditional, every relationship, every family, there's one way to do kind of everything. And, in that there was a comfort. And sometimes, in my life, I guess maybe when it's chaotic, I'm like, I kind of miss that. And so I go back to my church and I like put myself in a mental state. I'm just going to re-enter this and I'm just going to see what it's like. And the one truth I've come away with is you can never go home. Mm-hmm. You never can. You can't, even if you want it. When you've left evangelicalism and you've gone kind of the paths that we're walking or similar ones, you have to actually let go of some things for real. Like you can't ever return to that pre-critical nostalgia. There are things you can now do with it that I think are helpful. But my first, I guess, tip or something for anyone else is that there's a real grief process of losing that. You have to like actually lose it, and not keep it in your mind as something that you can just return to. And so that's what it was like for me. On the other side of that, like relating to it in an honest way, I relate to evangelicalism as if it was a different religion. I think that is the one thing that has actually helped me in my process. This is where I'm at right now. It totally may change. Maybe it'll be helpful for someone listening, maybe not. But when I look at other religions, I allow them to believe what they believe. I don't try to explain their beliefs. I don't try to like pick them apart or own them for myself. I respect their ability to create meaning and express what they believe. And I do it respectfully. Right. And when I look at evangelicalism, not so much so because it's my context. I'm like, I'm not going to respect this. I'm going to pick it apart and destroy it because this is what I've been given and I'm going to wrestle with it critically. Right now, more lately, I've been like, well, when I was evangelical, I honestly believed this stuff and it ministered to my spirit and it was real for me and it was edifying and it was something that was just a part of my spirituality. And so I'm respecting my former self when I look back and I'm like, yeah, that is one way to go. That is one way to treat the Bible. That is one way to do church. That is one way to do family. I totally disagree with some things and I would never say I agree. I would never propagate some of those teachings or something, but at least I recognize it as one way to go and that there are people who are earnest in what they do. And so I think I've now had enough distance. For some people, they may never get here because they've been through too much pain, but I have enough distance to be able to look at those communities and be like, I don't have to judge when I go there. When I go home, I don't have to like pick it all apart. I can interact it as something that is different than me. That kind of pulls a little bit, Jeff, that pulls a little bit at like, what is Christianity? What is the church? Are we connected? Are we one thing? Yeah. Like I haven't resolved that in my mind, but I've at least like kind of let go trying to make sense of the differences.
See, where you're at right now is where I was a year and a half ago. And
by the way, everything I've ever done has been following in your footsteps. Since I was a kid.
I have reverted back. The rise of Trump was a real difficult thing for me. And it really undid some of the peace that I had made in that place of, live and let live kind of thing, because I was watching, like I saw this arc of people that, like you said, that I respected still, that still had this, sense of integrity about them. That was like, okay, I believe this. And even though I would never, I'm never going to act as though it's live and let live when it comes to certain issues like the inclusion of LGBTQ community, racism, the environment, stuff like that I think are moral imperatives. But when it comes to doctrine or how you read the Bible, again, I was where you're at. And, I would still say if someone said to me, well, they're good people, they're approaching the world in the way that they're approaching it and all that kind of stuff. And then to watch this arc that happened. So during the primaries, when Trump was kind of gaining traction, to hear these people say, we can't vote for Trump, blah, blah, like here's all this going on. And then slowly when he becomes the only person left, and then to watch the hoops that so many of them, probably the last couple of months, there's been mostly silence, but to watch the hoops that they jump through to justify, really,
grabbing after power.
Yeah, I really had a tough time with it, and I'm still having a tough time with it.
That's interesting
because it made it harder for me to hold on to that idea of, I have a lot of respect for this person or that person, and
because you saw real world damage.
I did
from the system,
and a real sacrifice of the things that they held on to, just from a political standpoint, I don't think that the religious right can ever stand on, family or values or, all those things that they propped up, which, depending upon where you do about it, there's something good about standing for fidelity, obviously commitment is important and all that, but just to throw it out the window because there's this hate or just vile things being said at the idea of Hillary Clinton being president. And I don't think it was exclusive to Hillary. It just seemed the Clintons seemed to, I don't know. It was a really difficult time for me. And I'm still kind of like wading through the rubble. And every time Trump comes up with something else, it's really difficult for me. And I know, it shouldn't be connected that much. It shouldn't be this Republican equals evangelicalism, but I just
and not all evangelicals are like that. I know that's probably trite to say because evangelicals did elect Donald Trump, right? But
of course not all.
And whether you equate him or not, there are very public figures of evangelicalism equating themselves with Trump supporting, like the liberty stuff, like that's
Liberty, Franklin Graham, just the worst of the things. And I've seen those personalities being represented and lifted up by people that I've respected. I don't have any stake in the
John MacArthur told us all to vote for Donald Trump. I watched that video and he's like the head of all of where I come from. He's like the mouthpiece. And he said, don't vote for Donald Trump, but vote for his policies, and his policies are awful, but that's another subject.
But those are all things that they would never say about anything else. And we don't mean to make this a political thing, but this era in political history is so connected to my personal journey and having like some sort of reconciliation with my past that I really struggle because I do stand on other things. Like I find that I feel that. Yeah, I find that I still miss and long certain aspects of evangelical liturgy or worship, whatever we want to call it. Right. The ability to experiment and be open with the way that we worship, I feel like is really lacking within more of a mainline tradition.
And especially to add to that awe of like the transcendence of God. I believe God's immanent and present with us, but also this like, I'm going to worship God, like that part has been absent for a lot of my experience too, outside of evangelicalism.
Yeah. And I think, and I get why. But because it's different. It's foreign to most people in that situation. I feel like I gained so much from my upbringing as an evangelical. Like especially when it comes to like seeing kids and youth in churches that I've been attending or been at when it comes to more mainline denominations. Again, this is just my experience, but I remember just being so connected. Like youth group was such an important part of my life. And not necessarily because of the things I was learning or the things that I believed, because there's just this tightness, this community that was there that I tried to emulate everywhere I went, like to create this place where people felt like they were, they were at home, the Cheers effect, where everyone knows your name. And really, there was something about that. And I feel like that lacks more in my current experience, where it's just kind of a come and go kind of thing. And it's only connected to each other. There doesn't seem to be this connection, that our connection to each other seems to be glued together by the divine. Which I think that was a sense, at least in my experience with evangelicalism, that was a sense that I hope that I helped create in a way, through, whatever leadership style I have. But
I do want to clarify something that you pushed back on. When I say that it's a different religion and I let them experience what they experience and say what they say and believe what they believe without feeling like I have to correct them or change them or anything, it's not just a live and let live for me. I still believe in the marketplace of ideas and philosophy, and I don't think it's like, oh, anybody's truth, everything is fine. I think there are some harmful ideologies, and I will go out of my way to defend good ones, and I will spend my life in thought, in politics, in on the ground stuff. I'm going to fight for refugees, whether your religion defends them or not. And these are things that I always push for, but I'm not set out to invalidate people's experience of God or of worship. And that's where I was when I first left evangelicalism, going back to the churches and being like, God, like how do people do this? I guess it's a delicate balance, between respecting someone's faith and also disagreeing with it and battling the outcome of, hurtful ideologies in the public space. There's a balance there, right? One is a private message on Facebook. Another is a public figurehead making claims that have political ramifications. And I think those are maybe two different things, and maybe they're connected, and also one other thing. So part of it is you can never go home. I've had to grieve my loss of that community, re-entering into relationship as someone who's not a part of the community. Look, if they would open their doors to people like me, I could still be a part of their community. But because of the way they've defined things, I'm not in it. So I recognize that I'm not in it, and I respect that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you held on to the evangelical moniker much longer than any of us.
As long as I could. And honestly, I'd be there. I would still call myself evangelical if they would have had me, but they don't. And it's not that I want. Obviously, now there's so much baggage with that I wouldn't even want to be associated with some of the stuff that happens in the evangelical church. But what was the third thing? So I said you can never go home. Treating as a different. Oh, the third thing is just waiting. I know this sounds really weird, but like in all of my conversations with people, one of the most wise things my mom ever told me. I was frustrated because our family wasn't praying enough. Maybe that hasn't aged well. We're not in the segment yet, but Alan's angst as like an angsty, little, religious kid did not age well. And I go to my mom, I'm like, we're not praying as a family. We're not praying enough or something. And she takes me aside and she goes, those are good feelings. And she validates that. And then she says, and Alan, you have to know that everyone's at different places. And like, that was really big for me as a junior hire. I was like, oh, okay. That's true. Everyone is at different places, and that's okay. And so as I've gone through my process, there are people that were very combative at first, that were very upset at me for kind of switching teams or abandoning the true gospel or something like that, which is so weird, dude. I believe in Jesus. Never mind. That's a totally different sidetrack. I don't have to say that I'm the same. And I waited for those people. I still hung around, like whether it's online or whatever. I didn't burn ties. I didn't defriend them. I didn't like rail against everyone. I clearly stated what I believed. I posted stuff that was like, this is why I accept evolution, like years ago. And people were upset about that. But like, I never attacked anyone. I really, just kind of remained present and left open relationship. There are so many people who have arrived at different places in their faith journey where they're no longer fitting really well into that mold anymore. And they've talked to me. And so, I think sometimes this is a waiting game. People may never come around or may never end up where you're at. And that's totally fine. I'm not out to just make everyone like me, but it's actually given, a lot of freedom for people to feel like they're safe around me. And man, if you can be a safe place for people who are in your former context, they're not getting that where they're at as far as evangelicalism. If you're a former evangelical and you're following maybe this podcast and you're inspired by some of the stuff that we're saying, God, hear my call. I'm going to be preachy right now. Be a safe place for the people who are processing their crap in your former places. Whatever you do, like, I don't know, season your stuff with grace. Yes, stay strong for what you believe, fight what needs to be fought for, but leave open relationship because people come around and not everyone from your former context believes the same thing. They're just forced to be in a mold. And when that starts to shake up, like, they're going to need people like you, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's an important point, because I think if we all think back to our times where we were questioning and we were looking around and feeling like, I don't know if I could talk to anyone about this, to know that there's someone there who's still connected to you, that you've watched that journey that at times you might have been disgusted with, but now you're kind of like, oh, maybe that makes a little bit more sense, and maybe I can get on board with that, and maybe, okay, I'll talk to them. Because I think keeping those lines of communication, again, assuming that it's still a friendship and there hasn't been this, any kind of abuse or anything like that. I think that those are important things. And I think
I had those people, and sometimes they're even just like authors or something. I'm like, ew, they're so far off base. They're so wrong. And then I come in my faith journey to a point where I'm like, oh my God, like
so
they're
right.
so helpful. Yeah. Holy crap. They're life-giving, man. I need them right now. And like that's happened to me personally.
Yeah. And I think it's a matter also. I mean, obviously all of this is just a byproduct of deconstruction. It's that whole process of I'm tearing things down, I'm rebuilding things, and you have a love-hate relationship with your former context. You have seasons where you're like, I don't want anything to do with this, I want to get out of there. And then you have seasons where you realize, okay, these were important building blocks in who I am now. And it's an assimilation process. Is how do you take all this stuff and how do you reuse some of the materials from your deconstruction in your reconstruction, and where does it fit in new places? And that's a difficult journey, and it's a journey that I think on a certain level can be a healthy thing to do it in a semi-public way, whether it's through social media, to know that for people that are still in that context that may be asking those questions.
Yeah. And it may be hard and lonely though, because there are people that are watching that who are still using those constructions and buildings, and you're sitting there doing all of that stuff. They're going to be offended by it, or it's going to touch on their identity or something. And so, it may be a difficult thing and maybe isolating, but part of that public thing is important if you can do it that way.
There's a range. Like Alan and I are probably on the opposite spectrums as far as like how much we choose to interact when it comes to Facebook and certain things that come up. I've curated my Facebook to be a place of just food and fun, and I keep it light and all that kind of stuff, because for me it's not the place to engage. For me it's not the place to get into all that. I have other avenues like the podcast, and I'd rather do it in person when I talk to people.
And to be fair, I don't always engage. Sometimes I just like say something and then everybody else kind of takes off, and then I just kind of remain at the table if anyone wants to speak. But
most of the time it's Alan putting out a self-perceived harmless little Facebook status, and everyone jumps on top. Stuff that I think is harmless as all get out. Yeah. But I mean, I think that's all in our way. I think that what we need to be for our own self-care, our own personal place, is we just need to be aware of how certain things affect us. And if it's becoming unhealthy for us, then sometimes we do need that distance. Sometimes we do need that time away. Sometimes we do need that place. And I think probably for us, it just seems natural to hold the course and do things a little public, because that was the nature of what we did when we were in evangelicalism. We were pastors. We were up front. And I know that's not the way for everyone else.
Absolutely. And I'd like to know, if you're listening to this conversation and you have tips or even just experiences, if you want to write a little like, hey, this was me going home, or this was my experience with it, or I want nothing to do with it, we'd love to know that. Like we developed personal relationships with some of our listeners, and like, I want to hear your story. I mean, it really does matter to me. So send it to us on the email, or there's 100 different ways to connect to us.
Yeah, we have all of our information on the website, irenicast.com, or in the show notes for this particular episode, which is irenicast.com/105. But yeah, I think that this is a really a big thing, and it at least for me, it's ebbed and flowed so far as how much I can reconnect. And I think it's much easier for me to reconnect to the people than it is the places.
Yes.
You mentioned going back to your church. I don't know if I don't know if I've ever been back to a church that I've left, with the exception of my home church, and actually gone back for like a Sunday morning service. I've never done that.
I did it. It was so surprising to me how much every song was about like the penal substitutionary atonement. I mean, the introduction song, every single song was like, I've crafted worship services now, being out where I'm at, and I'm like, man, this is a one-trick pony. No offense, but like, man, it's the stuff you see when you're gone for a long time is kind of blaring, in your face. And anyway, it's an odd experience for me. For sure.
I preached at an evangelical church after I had started working at a mainline church. I'd been there for maybe a year and a half. And, I forgot how like much physical endurance you needed. Cause for an evangelical service, you're standing for a long time for worship, 3 to 5 songs, lazy, depending upon the church. And I'm used to, getting up and getting down.
Right.
But I was standing up so long. I was like, man, I'm going to sit down soon.
I know. For me, it was the 45-minute sermon. It was like, I grew up preaching 45-minute sermons. Now they're 12 or everyone gets upset. And, I went back there. I was like, wow, dude. Like, this is crazy. I love it though. If I could go back to that, I would.
You'd go back to preaching 45 minutes. That's why you have a podcast.
Well,
now.
I know I'm long-winded, dude. That's the problem. I just like talking. I messaged my former youth leaders from when I was in high school, and like former students that were in high school when I was in high school, the older ones who led worship. And we had a really interesting worship like band when I was younger. All these people would train younger people in worship, and they would actually write their own songs and stuff. And it was like this. It was all acoustic guitar, right? Like everything was written for guitar. And I messaged them and I was like, "Hey, I'm introducing new songs to my church. Would you be willing to send me like songs from the past?" And like, this is crossing enemy lines, dude. Like they preach sermons that are like, I'm sending people to hell in my church, right? Like, and so they were gracious. They were like, "Yes, I'll send you all the stuff." And they just Dropboxed me like the entire set list of every camp that was ever done, like all of the documents for all the worship, all the core songs, all the extra ones, the devotionals and stuff. And I was like, wow. So I combed through it. Like, I want to say 1,000 songs, dude. There's a lot. And, I picked out 4 that I thought were usable for my context now, because some of them are a little bit, maybe not. And, I actually started teaching him to my church. So talk about like integration and like reconnecting to my past. I'm like standing up front teaching these brand new contemporary songs from 1985 to all of my my congregation. But it's been really fun. Yeah, it's interesting for sure. Anyway, that's a side note.
It's funny that you mentioned the whole worship thing, and I know we've touched on it throughout this conversation, but man, if I had to pick one or the other, thumbs up, thumbs down, I much prefer the evangelical worship overall.
Right.
Just as far as an experience on Sunday morning than I do with current mainline.
Right.
Is it mainline? I always say that.
Mainline,
I always default to that, but I guess that's, yeah.
It's just, I hear that everywhere. From all my former evangelical friends and ministers. It's like, where is the progressive evangelical church? Where is it, man?
Yeah.
Where's the one with the service just like we grew up with, but with different wording and terminology and better philosophy and outlook and practice? Where is that at? And it's nowhere.
It's not there because everyone leaves, right? They're not going to new churches. They're just bailing. And I think that particularly mainline denominations are missing out on opportunity to bring a whole generation of people in.
Well, it's happening right now because of the Trump stuff. There's a billion articles. We can link one in the description. Articles of people leaving conservative churches, looking for more liberal ones because of the Trump era, because they're sitting in churches that are not addressing these real world problems. The stuff that's happening with Trump.
No, I know that's happening, but it's such a contrast in worship style. Because I don't even think it's a matter of like contemporary versus tradition. I've always hated that dichotomy. I think it's just a matter of context, right? Like,
yes.
You're providing a space, and too many times churches want to inform instead of invite. And I think that there's a subtle difference between that. Like both require presenting information as far as here's a doorway into our context. Here's why we believe this. Here's what we do it. But teaching that in such a way that's inviting as opposed to just like, here's the information and leaving you to your own devices. Because honestly, my latter part of my time in an evangelical church, I really started to embrace the idea of liturgy because I experienced it through a way that I understood its meaning before I understood its practice, because I wasn't in a church like that. And I
read those books that you had. They were all over your house. I picked them up.
I wish that more mainline churches would be more inviting in the way that they present their liturgy, because I do think that there's power in it. I think there's amazing things in it, but I also think that, everyone always talks about, and this is kind of a side note, but it's a rant and I'm going to do it anyway. But everyone always talks about how like the hymns are full of theology, but every time someone sings a hymn, I think the theology is awful in those hymns.
It depends on which hymn. Those stuff from like the early 1900s and like the mid 1900s. Oh my gosh. It's like, it's some of the most, no offense to everyone who loves it, it's pretty vapid, dude. It is.
And there doesn't seem to be this willingness at all to change the wording. Like it's so patriarchal. A lot of it is like, I just don't like it. And I could say the same, obviously the words of a lot of evangelical songs, praise songs or whatever, I agree the same thing. But, I just wish that there was a place that people would appreciate all kinds of worship styles within the Christian context and be able to embrace all of it and not just dismiss it. In my experience has been in mainline that they are far more dismissive of evangelical worship style than evangelicals are of mainline worship style.
I agree. I would agree with that in general. I've seen that too.
And dismissive is a nice word that I'm using, because sometimes it's just like I don't even want, like, they'll start talking about it. And I don't even say anything because inside I'm like, well, it's not that bad. You've never experienced it and you're just trashing it for no reason.
I know. But it's all about relationship and like physical proximity. Could you take some of the people in my church and they went to a bigger evangelical church for the first time and listened to worship? They're like, whoa. Everybody was singing up because they're looking at a projector or a screen and not looking at the books. Like, oh man, it was so crazy and different.
At the church that I'm at right now, we switched to looking up at the screen and it was louder. Like people, it felt
that truly
bigger.
Is a side note. That truly is a side note to this conversation. But I do feel good. This conversation is just the beginning. I want to hear from everyone. Like, what can we do to relate to our previous context? Is it worth it even? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And how much of your previous context have you come to terms with? Do you actually embrace and are thankful for? Because I think that that's an important part of the process. In order to engage, there still needs to be,
to some people, that's going to sound offensive, but it's important for me.
Commonality is important for any kind of connection with someone, to know that you're on the same level on some level. Mm-hmm. That's a little convoluted, but I think it makes any sense. Comment to the show. Reach out to us. We have a presence pretty much on any social media platform. All that information is in the show notes at irenicast.com/105. And we want to continue to explore these ideas and have conversations like this that are a little bit more informal, but and more based on experience, because that's kind of where we're all at. And we really want to take this new era of Irenicast and really have more conversations and more engagement with you, our listeners. So again, all the information at the show notes, irenicast.com/105. So on the other side of the music, we are going to be sharing our top 3 things that have not aged well since our childhood. So we have discovered on the show, since no longer having Mona as a regular part of the show, some of the games that we used to do are a little bit more difficult when it comes to just 2 people. So until we can start filling the pulpit, so to speak, and bringing in some guest co-hosts, we're going to try to experiment with some new segments. And we figured, what's more wonderful than a top 10 list or a top 5 list? And since there's, a limited amount of time, we're going to bring out some top 3 lists. And we're going to start our top 3 with top 3 things that have not aged well from our childhood. So, you know how when you're a kid,
other than my body,
other than our physical endurance, or hair color or hairline.
Your sciatic nerve.
Yeah. So, you know, those things that you were like, you had this fond memory of when you were a kid, and you go back to try it as an adult and you're like, oh man, I should have just kept that memory and not experienced this. So we have the top 3 things. And these, when we say top 3, we are gauging them by its level of disconnectedness, I guess.
Yes. Of not aging well.
Right.
Of spoiledness. Mm-hmm.
So let's start with number 3. Alan, what's your number 3?
So this is the hardest segment I've ever done on the show. We've had some hard segments, but the level of invisibility toward my own shame that I still have is unrivaled by anyone I've ever met. I don't feel shame. Everything is amazing to me and fun, and I should be ashamed of some things that I'm not. So I had to really rack my brain, like, what hasn't aged well? And these 3 are the 3 things that came to mind. Literally, I have none others because I'm just who I am. Lovable kid next door.
There's
number
something
3
to be said about that, Alan. There's something
something special about
something
that.
good to be said about that.
My heart has aged well.
You've not been disenfranchised by the world.
You know, my older brother, God, I love my older brother. He had to teach me how to be cool. He was like, Alan, that's not cool. It was like, you know, How I Met Your Mother interventions or whatever. Like everyone sits down. He had those with me. Hey, Alan. And I would be like, thank you, John. That means the world to me. So the first one, number 3, would be my rock collection. I had a really big duffel bag. It was a duffel bag filled with like random rocks, not special minerals, just like rocks you find that look different than other ones all over the place. And I would just have this big duffel bag full of them. And I look back at it now and I'm like, yeah, the indiscriminate rock collector doesn't age well. What's wrong with this kid? Yeah.
I have a feeling that our top 3 are going to be very different in terms of like genre and category.
Probably.
Clearly, I am not a rock fan.
I didn't grow up with TV, Jeff.
Unless it's the rock. Exactly.
I grew up with rocks, Jeff.
Yeah, all mine is TV, movies, and food. So I'm just gonna put that out there right there.
Sharpen sticks on the concrete out back so we can make bows and arrows to go hunt animals.
That was not my
really
not my thing. No.
Oh man,
I certainly played outside a lot, but I didn't.
You played out in your apartment.
I didn't do weapons. I didn't do man things. I didn't do guy things.
That's because your police were driving around.
Oh man. All right. So my number 3 is fresh for me because over the summer the movie It came out. I don't know if anyone saw it. The remake of the novel by Stephen King, and I read the novel when I was in high school, but I remember when the original It miniseries came out on television and had Tim Curry as Pennywise the clown. And I just had this image in my head of Tim Curry being terrifying and just the perfect casting and that whole miniseries being really, really scary. And then I rewatched it in preparation for the new movie to see like, hey, how does it hold up? And it does not hold up. It was awful. It was horrible acting. It was just, I mean, Tim Curry still holds up a little bit, at least his particular performance because it's Tim Curry, but man, it did not hold up. I was really disappointed that I even watched it because now I have no notion of it ever being anything good. Which is sad.
You ruined that childhood memory.
I did. I ruined a lot of childhood memories.
Hey, this is on point for this episode because we're relating to our past.
That's right.
It's a great idea, Jeff.
That's right.
Number 2 for me, the one thing I could think of that didn't age well. There's pictures of me from 6th grade. I used to go to school with purple sweatpants and hiking boots with the shoelaces were those twirl shoelaces that you don't have to tie. They just twirl up, and hiking boots didn't age well. I mean, I look back at it and I'm like, I was the kid with hiking boots at school, that like kind of chubbier white kid with hiking boots is just not, it doesn't go, it's not good. But at the time, way friggin' cool. The 90s was a weird decade for a lot of people, but weirder for me. Hiking boots and sweatpants don't age well. That's all I'm saying. Right.
You're not rocking them now.
I have my PJs on, but not not sweatpants. No.
All right, so my number 2 is probably my fondest memories of childhood was actually being in Little League. Before baseball got all competitive in high school and all that kind of stuff. I loved Little League. And to me, one of the best things about Little League was pretending to have tobacco chew in that envelope that was filled with fruit-flavored bubblegum called Big League Chew.
Woohoo! I love that stuff.
Just cramming as much in your mouth as possible while you're sitting on the bench. And recently I was at a candy store with my daughters and I saw that they had a pouch.
Are you serious?
And I was like,
I haven't had Big League Chew in like maybe 18 years, dude.
I know. And I was like, I got to do this. I got to do this. Like, I'm going to buy it. So I bought it and then I tried it and it was disgusting. And the flavor was like gone within like 2 seconds. And I was just
That's how it was back then too. We just forgot.
I felt like my childhood and the memories of Big League Chew was like this freshly painted mural. And then someone just threw a bunch of water on it and it just faded and smudged into nothingness.
A gloop of unflavored.
I should have just like looked at the package and allowed like the nostalgia to flood over me and then just walk out. But I didn't. I tried it and I regret every moment of it.
That's a good metaphor for a lot of things.
Big League Chew. Like don't try it if you had good memories of it.
I did have good memories. I still do. And part of me wants to go try it now.
Sit in it, Alan. You're going to lose it. And
I used to wait to catch fly balls or whatever, foul balls. Because if you caught a foul ball and ran to the like snack bar, they give you free Big League Chew, dude. Oh my goodness.
The Little League snack bar. Good
That's
times.
sad. Okay, so my number 1 is a movie. It was a movie that was one of my favorite movies as a kid, and I rewatched it and probably brings me the most pain. And that is The Buttercream Gang. Have you seen this? It's like a Christian movie.
I have not seen it. I've heard of it. I've heard you mention it several times.
I think now we're going to have a party, Jeff.
You know what? Maybe we'll do it for Divine Cinema and we'll have you on as a guest.
It's too painful to watch for Divine Cinema. Like there's this angry kid from the city and, he leaves, he goes to the city, he changes and comes back. And it's just like the Buttercream Gang are these people who help these kids who form this like little club and they help people like, They bring stuff to people, old people, and they help people. And they like, there's this older kid who's like troubled. Anyway, I went back to watch it and like, I couldn't sit through like 5 minutes. It was absolutely terrible. And, every awful thing that you could possibly think about, Christian movies in general and that whole time period of the world, it's all there. So you're not going to watch it. It did not hold up well.
Yeah. I've never watched it, so I have no fun.
None of my Christian stuff held up well, dude. I used to watch stuff
hold up well.
Like McGee and Me in my head from when I was younger. It's like awesome. It's like this little, cartoon character that comes to life and like, it's like this Christian family film. You look at it now and it's like, oh my God, there's some awful stuff in here.
Yeah. Doing
just terrible
Divine
screenwriting.
Cinema. I've reviewed some of the movies that I used to like, cause when you're a youth pastor and you wanted to show movies, you always had to like be pretty selective. And the hoops that I jumped through mentally to say, oh, this isn't too bad. It's pretty good. And I've gone back and watched some of them and it's like, no, it was never good. And
Young Jeff, we need to have a conversation.
Huh?
I say, young Jeff, sit down. There's some things you need to know.
Speaking of young Jeff, like the whole Facebook memories for the most part has been a good thing.
Oh my gosh.
But then I'm looking like there's this era of Facebook posts that I had that are like, I'm still at a pastor at an evangelical church and I'm trying to express things and they're like vague and whiny. And I'm just like, I can't believe
I'm there, man.
Put that out there.
I think mine are a little more immature than yours. Cause how when you're immature, you say certain things. Thank God Facebook wasn't around when I was in junior high.
Oh my gosh.
Amen. Amen,
tell
everyone.
Me about it. If we weren't doing childhood, Facebook posts would be my number 3, like things that have not aged well.
Yes. So there's a couple like sitting on the couch with my wife and dog watching TV. Like who posts that on Facebook? I was like, dude, what the heck? Like more, that's a benign version of some of the stuff I've seen that I posted like 10 years ago. Oh my gosh, dude. We had no filter back then.
No,
early Facebook days.
Early Facebook days. I'm glad
people used to message to each other on their Facebook wall and not because there was no messaging app or there was no way to like message each other. So we would just leave these long, really personal posts on people's walls. So I see them like every day. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. It's pretty bad.
What's your number one?
My number one is a couple years ago, Netflix finally got the rights to put all of the show Friends on Netflix.
Right.
And I remember as a mid-adolescence really liking Friends. It was on after Seinfeld, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna rewatch Friends. I haven't seen it in a long time. I haven't had cable in a long time, so I've never seen any reruns or anything like that. So I committed. I'm just gonna, over the next couple months, I'm just gonna run through the whole series. And there may be some hate out there about what I'm about to say, but it did not age well. In fact, I hated it. In fact, the only redeeming quality of Friends was that it made me like How I Met Your Mother even more. And I actually gained respect for Ted. And if you don't know me, and if I haven't said this on the show at all, is that I loved How I Met Your Mother, but the character of Ted from How I Met Your Mother, I despised. He's pretentious, whiny, over-romanticizes everything, and I just wanted to slap him every opportunity I could get a chance. But then I watched Friends.
I was there for some episodes, and you had a long-running dual with that man.
I did.
Character.
I did. And then I watched Friends, and I was like, you know what? At least Ted is earnest. And, there's a genuine nature about his douchiness. But Ross from Friends, the worst character on television ever. There was nothing redeeming about him. He was selfish. He was whiny.
So he wasn't a complex character, just kind of
nothing complex. There's nothing complex about that show at all. In fact, all of the humor when it comes to the guys was either homophobic or super macho kind of humor. And it was just over and over. And it was essentially the same joke.
Track.
It was horrible. I got through it because at least some of the things I had fond memories of, but talk about context, realizing, oh man, I can't believe I thought that was funny, or man, I can't believe. Yeah, it was horrible.
There was a time, Jeff, when you were maybe less complex and a little more easily understood yourself.
Well, certainly easily amused because I liked Friends.
I miss that Jeff.
Oh.
That Jeff was a good Jeff.
It was. It just didn't hold up well for me. So I'll receive your hate
I'm
mail.
I'll watch a Friends episode because I've only seen one, and I have no staying power with any TV show ever except Stranger Things. But I'll watch one episode of Friends if you watch Buttercream Gang. Deal?
I will watch Buttercream Game. I'm really tempted. I think that should be
pretty
a
rough.
Divine Cinema episode. If it's,
I don't know about that. You should watch it first before you say that.
It's a bad Christian movie. Well, if I watch it, I might as well not waste the time and do a podcast on it.
Oh, that's great.
Oh man! All right. Well, I think that will do it for this week's journey down memory lane. If you enjoy what you hear and you want to support the show, you can go to irenicast.com/support for a list of ways to do so. And again, we want to hear from you. Tell us about your experiences. Interact with the show by either leaving a review or a rating on your preferred listening platform, or preferably sending us an email. Our email addresses are on the website, on the show notes at irenicast.com/105. And we want to hear from you. And speaking of hearing from you, we got our very first international Apple Podcast review from Catherine, a longtime listener, very supportive of the show, and from New Zealand, which is awesome. And she said, fantastic for theology geeks and Christians with questions. I love this podcast. I have a Bachelor of Divinity, and Irenicast helps me keep my theology brain going. Alan, Jeff, and Mona and their guests have also opened my eyes to ways I can be more inclusive and more like Jesus. Thank you so much, Catherine. We really appreciate those reviews. They're like fuel to our fire. So Alan, what do you got going on this week? How can people find what you're doing?
We're doing our second installment of Intersections, which there are three amazing reverends who are a part of the UCC that come from evangelical context too. Seventh-day Adventists, some Lutheran backgrounds and evangelical backgrounds. And we're doing a brick and mortar version. And I've announced it several times, so I'll just cut it short. But we're meeting at a pub in Roseville. If you're in Northern California, look it up. Intersections, Facebook.com/The Intersections. We're basically just eating and drinking and talking about certain topics. And the topic we just covered is actually going to be our next thing. So that's coming up. Oh, and also I'm visiting on this week. So tomorrow, I'm visiting an immigration detention center in my city. Apparently ICE has immigration detention centers all over California. And there's one like 4 exits on the freeway away from me, or 3. And, I'm going to go with a volunteer program that serves a dual purpose to end isolation for some detainees, that they actually have visitors, people coming there to see them, so that they know someone on the outside, and also as a watchdog for the institutions that detain people, immigration centers. And so I'm going with that volunteer program. It's all over the United States, and I'm checking it out for the first time. I look forward to finding out about it, doing the work, and then maybe bringing some interviews in the future to the podcast on that specific thing.
Yeah.
Yep. And then maybe you all can get involved too. We'll see.
Sounds good. And as usual, the only thing I got going on right now is the second podcast, Divine Cinema. We are posting on the second and third Thursdays of every month. And the next episode that comes out, we're going to be doing one of my favorite movies called Calvary. It was a 2014 Irish film about a Catholic priest. The opening scene of that movie is he sits in a confessional booth, and you don't see who's in the confessional booth. And he says, "Father, I'm going to kill you. I was molested by a priest, and the world won't pay attention if I kill a guilty priest. But if I kill an innocent one," and it becomes this essentially passion narrative, right? So he takes on the Christ role, not in like the typical American Christ prototype where they become the hero and they sacrifice for others, but in the sense of here's an innocent person taking on the punishment of someone else's sin. And it is beautifully shot, beautifully written, beautifully acted. So if you want to hear a review of that movie, listen and subscribe to Divine Cinema. It's become a fun podcast to do. So a nice spin-off from some of our past episodes. All right. Well, that will do it for us. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Alan.
And thanks for joining the conversation.
Peace.